welcome to your Kin 225 class for today. If you enjoy 17th century German pipe organ music, I know that you would have enjoyed that. Okay. So a couple of announcements for you to start off as usual. I'll be sending you your final exam to do online. I'm going to make it on the scheduled original exam date. So that is Saturday, April 25th. You will have all day to do that exam. So it's supposed to be on time according to the university policy. It'll be open book. So I want you to try to hand it in by the end of the day, Saturday, April 25th. It's 120 multiple choice questions, 30 from material before the midterm, 90 from material after the midterm. So an emphasis on the second half of the course. Your lab number 7 is due today. That is April 6th. Email me if you have any questions while you're studying for your final exam. So today's class, I'm going to review hypertrophy, hyperplasia, aerobic adaptations, and protein expression. And for the main part of today's class, I'm going to go over the principles of training overload, variety, and specificity. And I haven't added this into this slide, but I'm also going to be covering bone physiology as the last topic for your course. So multiple choice question for you here. Which of the following is true? Hyperplasia refers to an increase in muscle fiber number. Hypertrophy refers to an increase in muscle fiber size. Hypertrophy occurs when there is an increase in myofilaments, or all of the above. The correct answer here is all of the above. So the myofilaments refer to your actin myosin, and also associated with that is your troponin and tropomyosin. Those increase in number to cause your muscle fibers to become bigger. So you get hypertrophy of your muscle fibers because these proteins are increasing within each muscle fiber. So your correct answer here is all of the above. Myoglobin can carry oxygen in the blood. This is false. So it's hemoglobin that carries oxygen in the blood. Myoglobin are located in the muscle and they carry oxygen from the muscle fiber membrane to mitochondria within the muscle. So myoglobin are located within the muscle. They're a protein that carries oxygen inside the muscle. An increased capillary to fiber ratio will result in faster blood flow past muscle fibers during exercise. This is false. So if you have a given blood volume and it's flowing through your capillaries, if you have few capillaries, then that blood volume is going to be going faster through your capillaries. If you have a greater number of capillaries for a given blood volume, the blood's going to flow slower through those capillaries. And the advantage there is that you get a greater chance of hemoglobin, of oxygen being delivered from hemoglobin to the inside of the muscle fiber. So if your blood is flowing too fast by your muscle fibers, oxygen won't have a chance to dissociate from hemoglobin to get inside the fibers. So it's good to have a high capillary to fiber ratio. It slows down the blood flowing past the muscle and it allows oxygen to better dissociate from the hemoglobin to be delivered to the muscle fibers. Increase of which of the following would not lead to increased muscle mass? So you've got myogenic regulatory factors, mRNA transcribing from myofibrillar protein, myostatin, satellite cells, and myonuclei. So your correct answer here would be C, would be your myostatin. So myostatin inhibits satellite cell activation, so that would lead to a decrease in muscle mass. So your correct answer here is C. Now I've got an exercise for you here of putting these steps in proper sequence for events that will occur in your muscle after you start a resistance training program. So this all has to do essentially with protein synthesis. So I'm going to go to this page here to number these. So the earliest change you see, and you probably see this say within minutes or hours, after you do a resistance training session is you'll see an upregulation in these myogenic regulatory factors. So that's the first thing you'd see. And these are referred to as transcription factors. So they turn on transcription in your nucleus. So the next thing you'd get here is increased transcription. Remember that transcription refers to copying a code for a protein on your DNA to messenger RNA within the nucleus. So the next step you would have here is you would have increase in mRNA encoding, in this case for myofibrillar proteins, and that would occur, then leave the nucleus and it will appear outside the nucleus. So that's your third step. So you probably see this again within minutes to hours of a resistance training session. So those are the early increases you see, say, within the same day as doing your resistance training session. The next thing you'd have is, let's see here, you would have increased binding of mRNA with the ribosomes. So once it leaves the nucleus, it will find these ribosomes in the cytoplasm, and that's essentially where your protein construction will occur. So the next step here is that you would get the messenger RNA bound with the ribosomes. It's got a message for a specific protein, and that specific protein has to be made up of a sequence of amino acids. So amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So the next thing you get here is you get increased tRNA transporting amino acids to the ribosomes. So this is tRNA would be your transfer RNA. It carries one amino acid at a time to the ribosome to build your protein. So that is your next step. That's number 5. That whole process is called translation. So it's taking the code on mRNA and building your protein according to that code. So once you get those amino acids coming in, you can say that you've got increased translation. So that's number 6. Then the next thing you'd have is you'd have the protein being synthesized, so increased myofibrillar protein synthesis. So that's number 7. And then finally, with the increase in amount of myofibrillar protein, the muscle fiber would become larger, so you get hypertrophy of the muscle fibers. So that would be your last step, number 8. So that's your correct sequence of events for protein synthesis after a resistance training session. Okay, that pretty much covers the protein section of the course. The next little section I'm going to cover here is training principles. And I focus mostly on resistance training here, but this could apply to any sport or any type of training. So the principles here are overload, variety, and specificity. So these are commonly taught principles for resistance training. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to try to apply the physiological evidence or support for these training principles. So the first principle here is the principle of overloading, and that's simply that you must progressively increase the difficulty of your training sessions to achieve overload and for your muscle to become to have appropriate adaptation. So for your muscle to become bigger and stronger, you need to progressively increase the intensity or the volume of your training sessions. So that can be done by increasing the weight lifted, the volume of exercise, so the sets of repetitions that you do, or decreasing the rest periods between your sets. So it's essentially just making the exercise a little bit more harder, a little bit more difficult as you progress with your training. So this is what happens if you don't apply overload to your muscle. So this is lifting the same weight before and after weeks of training. So you might get some hypertrophy, with the weeks of training, but then that would stagnate. And the reason it stagnates if you're lifting the same weight is that with this group of muscle fibers, So each of these cylinders represent a muscle fiber. At the start of the training, the shaded fibers represent the fibers that were activated to lift a given weight. So if you hold that weight constant after a few weeks of training, you become more efficient and your motor unit activation actually decreases. So you're recruiting a lower number of muscle fibers to lift the same weight after weeks of training. So this is not ideal. Ideally, you want to be recruiting all your muscle fibers during a resistance training session. So to achieve this, to keep the fiber recruitment high, you have to overload the muscle. So you have to do something to increase the training intensity to keep the activation of muscle fibers high. So principle of overload, this is kind of a summary here. As you progress through a resistance training program, your muscles become more efficient and a lower motor unit recruitment is needed to lift the same weight. So you have to progressively increase the difficulty of the weightlifting session. So increase the amount of load experienced by your muscle to keep motor unit recruitment high. And this principle is also referred to as progressive overload because you do this slowly and progressively from one training session to another. Now, how can you achieve a greater intensity of resistance training? These are just a few examples. So the first example I have here is forced repetitions. And I've got a YouTube video that I'm going to go to here. So I've got these queued up. And this is an example of forced repetitions. So you'll see these guys doing a set of biceps curls. And the one doing the curls, he goes a number of repetitions until he reaches failure. And then his buddy steps in here and helps him to get a few extra repetitions by helping him lift the bar, but just barely applying enough resistance to help him lift the bar. And that's going to overload this fellow's muscles. So it gets him past the point of normal exhaustion. And this is just one common way to apply overload to your muscles. So it's forced repetitions. Okay, cue up the PowerPoint again here. Another example is eccentrics. And I went over this in detail earlier in the course, so I won't go over it again, but the advantages here are that this type of muscle contraction produces the highest amount of force and therefore the greatest hypertrophy with training. And then eccentrics are important for many sports as well. So I covered that earlier in the course, how eccentrics can be important for sports that involve rapid changes in direction or high intensity landings. So that's why eccentrics are important. And again, the disadvantage of eccentrics is if you're not used to using eccentrics, you get this delayed onset muscle soreness. So you have to incorporate eccentric training carefully and very progressively when you start using it with a weight training program. Another way to achieve overload, and this is rarely done, is using isometrics. So just to review from earlier in the course, eccentric contractions produce the most force within a muscle, followed by isometrics, and then lastly, concentric contractions produce the lowest amount of force. So isometrics involve generation of force without movement. Again, they produce a lot of force, so that's the advantage. And they're more forceful than concentric contractions. So again, it's a good way to get overload of your muscles. And isometrics are also specific to certain sports. So an example of a sport using isometrics could be gymnastics, where you're doing certain holds. So this involves a lot of strength, but the muscle is not changing in length when you're doing this type of movement or this type of contraction. Another example of isometrics is in wrestling. So this girl on the top is trying to turn the girl on the bottom. She's trying to turn her onto her back to pin her. And this girl is placing her arm out here to try to prevent being turned over onto her back. She's also using her legs here. The legs and the arm that are trying to prevent being turned over are in a static position, so the muscles aren't really changing length. And that's a good example of an isometric contraction that might be specific to a certain sport. So isometrics generate force without movement. So the advantage is here are, again, allows quite a forceful contraction specific to certain sports. And it also allows one to overcome sticking points. So when you're lifting a weight through a range of movement, you often have points in that range of movement where you're weaker than others. And it prevents you from performing a successful lift. So you can train at your sticking points using isometric contractions to try to overcome those sticking points. And again, I've got a YouTube video here of someone doing isometrics in the weight room. So I'm just going to cue this up here. Again, this has to do with a bench press, and this could be just someone trying to get a more forceful contraction than doing concentric training, or it could be someone working specifically at their sticking point or their weak range of motion in the bench press. So you can see the way he has the rack set up here. He's got these stoppers in here to stop the weight. So he's just going to be pressing the weight up against those stoppers and then holding it against those stoppers. So he's holding it. When he hits that stopper, he's going to hold it, but he's still pushing on the bar to keep it up. And that essentially produces an isometric contraction. So he's holding it there isometrically, increasing his strength at that specific point in his range of motion, and also producing quite a high amount of tension anyways on the muscles involved in the bench press, so the triceps and the chest muscles. So that's just a good example of using isometrics. Okay, and back to the PowerPoint here. Okay, another point about overload is training to failure. So to achieve optimal hypertrophy, you want to train all the muscle fibers or motor units in a muscle. Now, a typical weightlifting set usually involves lifting a weight for 8 to 10 repetitions. That would be just an average typical weightlifting set. The question here is what type of motor unit would be recruited first, and then what type of motor unit would fatigue first during the 8 to 10 repetitions. So from earlier in the course, in the neural section, I talked about the orderly recruitment of motor units, and there's a size principle where your smaller motor units get recruited first. So the ones that are recruited first are your type 1 or slow twitch units, but the ones that would fatigue the first are your type 2 or fast twitch units because they're the most fatigable. So what this shows you is a typical progression through a set of resistance training. So this is your first repetition, say this is your fourth repetition, this is your eighth repetition, and the open circles represent motor units that are not recruited. The gray circles represent motor units that are recruited. The black ones represent motor units that are exhausted. So the fast twitch ones are your large motor units or motor neurons, and the slow twitch ones are your smaller motor units. So you can see the slow twitch get recruited first, and then they largely remain recruited, with few of them being exhausted by the eighth repetition. So again, the ones that are recruited are the gray ones. The ones that are colored black, are fatigued. So you can see that the fast twitch motor units, they come in later, but they're fatigued almost right away. So by the eighth repetition, you've pretty much fatigued all of your fast twitch motor units. Recall they fatigue easily. So once they get recruited, they get fatigued right away. Whereas you have not exhausted your slow twitch motor units. And this might be one of the reasons why you get preferential hypertrophy of the type 2 or fast twitch motor units with typical resistance training, because they will all be recruited and worked to their maximum, so exhausted. Whereas with the slow twitch ones, even though they're recruited first, they're not exhausted, so they're not really overloaded by the 8th repetition in that set. So the question here is, it's recommended that you perform your weightlifting sets to exhaustion until you fail, because that will allow you to get optimal motor unit recruitment. Now, how can you achieve complete exhaustion of those remaining slow twitch motor units that are not yet exhausted at the end of your exercise set? The answer here is that what you could do is, after you've reached exhaustion in this set, so you've lifted a given amount of weight, by the end here you can't support that weight because you've had dropout of too many motor units, you could then go down to a lighter weight that can be sustained by these non-exhausted motor units, and then you could do a set to failure to exhaust those motor units. Then you can do another set right away with a lower weight to exhaust any other motor units that have not been exhausted. So that's a way to achieve, say, complete exhaustion of your fast twitch and your slow twitch motor units. I've stuck this in the overload section because, by overloading your muscle, one way to achieve overload is to decrease the amount of rest between training sessions. So increasing the frequency of your training. Say, instead of training a muscle group twice a week, you might progress to training it 3 or 4 times a week. The question here is, what is the recommended frequency for strength training workouts? And ideally, you'll hear people say that the optimal frequency is to train a given muscle group every second day. So you usually want a day off to let a muscle group recover from an intense resistance training session before you hit it again. So that's variable. It's going to depend on the athlete. It's going to depend on their nutritional status. But the general recommendation is to take a day off, so to train a given muscle group every 48 hours. And there is some support with regards to how protein synthesis gets activated after strength training. So this graph shows your increase in protein synthesis at rest, and then 3 hours after a resistance training session, 24 hours after a resistance training session, and 48 hours. So you can see that your protein synthesis gets elevated after training, and it really doesn't go back down to baseline until about 48 hours later. So this justifies that frequency of training a muscle group every 48 hours. So you get this elevation in protein synthesis with one training session, and then it gradually goes down to baseline by 48 hours. So then you want to hit it again so you get that increase in protein synthesis. And this is just an example of, so I mentioned I'm applying most of these training principles to resistance training, but you can also apply overload to different sports by using different implements to make your training more difficult. So a good example of this, and again, I'm going to refer to this YouTube, I'm going to queue up a YouTube video here. Good example for baseball is this is using what's called a pancake glove or a paddle glove for fielding drills. So I'll just play this for you. So it's a type of glove that you would use to make your fielding more difficult with baseball. So you can see, instead of a typical baseball mitt, it's basically just an apparatus that you wear on your hand that's pretty much flat and pancaked. So it makes it more difficult to field a ball. So you really have to concentrate as a baseball player on your fielding technique to enable you to actually field a baseball wearing this flat type of glove it doesn't have any pocket. It's pretty much just flat. So it just makes the drill more difficult. And you'll see this guy go through a number of drills, to overload your nervous system, to make you more proficient at fielding. You can see he really has to concentrate on his technique here to get it right so that he doesn't mess up. So again, this would be a type of drill that baseball players would use to overload their nervous system to make them more proficient at fielding. Now, I like this part. He gets a buddy in here, applies like an elastic resistance around his band, around his waist, and he's making it again more difficult. He's getting a pretty good leg workout in there, something that you wouldn't get in a normal baseball game or doing regular fielding drills. But he's getting a pretty good overload here with that elastic band. So he's going in different directions now. So just to make the exercise more difficult than usual.
If you found this video helpful, please subscribe and then join the free.
There you go. Get back to your PowerPoint here. Strength training principles. The next one to talk about is variety. So to get optimal recruitment and training of your muscles, again, this applies to resistance training, your exercises must be changed frequently. So this is the most violated principle of training. So it's violated in that people that do resistance training tend to like to stick to their favorite exercises. And it's good to switch exercises up once in a while to get a more varied motor unit recruitment. So I'm going to show you, again, muscle fibers within a muscle and how they're recruited with different exercises. So in this case, the person is doing exercises that both train the pectorals or the chest muscles. One's doing dips and the other one is doing bench press. And these represent muscle fibers within the pectoralis. So with the dips, you might be recruiting these fibers that are shaded green, whereas these fibers would not be recruited during the dip exercise. But then if you switched it up and you did a different type of exercise, so you added variety here, you get recruitment, even though it's using the same muscle group, you get recruitment of a whole different set of muscle fibers doing this exercise. So this is the principle of variety. It's good to mix up your exercises to get a variety of exercises for each muscle group to get optimal recruitment of all the muscle fibers within that muscle. Now, variety can be introduced by changing different components of your programs. That includes grip, positioning. So you'll notice from the one EMG lab that you did that if you positioned your hands close together for the push-up versus further apart, you got more recruitment of your triceps, versus if you moved your arms apart, you got less, or your hands apart on the ground, you got less recruitment of your triceps and more recruitment, say, of your shoulder muscles. So positioning as variety, just picking a different exercise. So, you know, for legs, doing squat one day, maybe leg press the next day. Speed of contractions. So if you do high velocity movements, you're going to be recruiting more of those fast twitch motor units. Contraction types, so you know, switching up from doing eccentrics versus concentrics and isometrics, and then repetitions or loads. So you know, higher repetitions, you might recruit more the slower twitch motor units. The lower repetitions with higher load, you might be recruiting more your fast twitch motor units. The last principle I'll talk about here is specificity. And this is kind of opposite of variety. So now you're trying to train to match your sport performance as closely as possible. So, you know, you want to match your sport for contraction type, repetition, speed, movement patterns. So if your sport involves high velocities, you want to be training in the weight room at high velocities, doing something like power cleans, movement pattern. And what I've got here is again, another video for you just to show the principle of specificity as applied to sport. In this case, it's the sport of rugby, and I've got Hubert Bidens again. He's the prop on Team Canada who's from Saskatoon. He's going to be talking about specificity of training for his position as a prop in rugby. So this is kind of a neat video about specificity.
Slightly different. position, we like to focus a lot on the scrum. It requires a lot of core strength, lower back, obviously leg strength, and then your neck takes a lot of pounding. Just heading to the gym right now. I'll show you a couple exercises that we like to do to get game ready. One of the things we like to do is just some quarter squat isometric holds. The reason only a quarter squat is it kind of mimics the perfect scrumming position, and also it's a lot easier on your knee joints than if going full. First thing, you want to just address the bar. Make sure you keep your lats good and tight, tighten up the core, and then just sink down, making sure not to flare out your knees, keeping the core tight, keeping the lats nice and tight, making sure everything's good. Hold for about 4 or 5 seconds, and then just extend out, take a deep breath, core out again, and then repeat that 5 or 6 times. So this exercise is the diagonal or D lunge. Essentially the same thing as the squat, just keep everything tight, take a 45-degree step, and then really explode back out, and then alternate. This definitely helps us strengthen lateral movement because it's pretty rare in rugby where you're just running straight or tackling straight. There's oftentimes you'll have to go off to one side or the other. This allows for a little bit of sideways movement. Typically we would do 4 to 6 a leg, and then that would be one set. This next exercise is back extensions. Really strengthen the lower back aspect of the core and the glutes. Particularly important in the scrummaging aspect of the game. Allows you to transfer forces through you onto the opposition and through the opposition onto your players so that you don't crumble, basically. Stay as straight as possible and then just dip down and back up. If you want to make it more difficult, put your hands over your head. Go for 12 to 15 reps and then repeat that for 3 or 4 sets. Start with body weight to warm everything up and then pick up a kettlebell. The stronger and fitter you are, the easier it is when it comes to game time. So put the work in the gym.
Here's your inspirational video of the day. Okay. So quick exercise here on how to apply these principles of training to different parts of the year. So you're not going to be applying overload, specificity, and variety to all parts of the season. So I've got a mix and match column exercise for you here. I'm going to go to the piece of paper here, and for an athlete to match the training principle that would be applied to different parts of the year. So generally, specificity, we'll work on that one first. If you want to train more specific to your sport, it's important to do that, say, right before your competitive season, and then during your competitive season. You want to do exercises that match as closely to your sport as possible. Variety is kind of opposite. So variety, you're training a variety of muscle groups. You're trying to recruit all those motor units. It's something that you'd more do in the off season, and probably also immediately after your competitive season. Mix things up, not only focusing on the exercises you might do during the season, but immediately after the competitive season, you want to recover from injuries or from overuse, so you want to incorporate more variety there. Overload would be pretty much applied emphasized during all parts of the year. So during the off season, immediately before the competitive season, during the competitive season. During the competitive season, you'd want to decrease the frequency that you're training, say in the weight room, because you're going to be, playing matches or competing in events that involve high physical exertion once in a while. Overload would be de-emphasized immediately after the competitive season, again, just to allow yourself to recover from the rigors of the competitive season. Okay, with regards to training volume, when it would be high and low, I kind of mentioned this a little bit already. So preseason, you'd be going relatively high. During the competitive season, lower. immediately after the competitive season to allow yourself to recover low. And then off season is kind of high alternating with low. So, high to get that overload, but alternating with low to allow yourself adequate recovery. Periodization. So periodization refers to altering your training protocol throughout the year. So periods of high volume, high overload training are alternated with periods of lower volume training. This prevents overtraining, and it also allows you to peak for your competition. So you're not always going hard overload, you're not always going with high volume, because that will lead to overtraining. So it's alternated with lower periods of periods with low volume training and lower intensity training. So tapers are usually done, say 1 or 2 weeks before an important competition. So this is an example of a taper for sprint athletes. So tapers usually involve decreasing the volume of training. In this case, the taper for the sprint athlete, with intense training, they've reduced their type 2X fibers. It gets converted from type 2X pretty much to type 2A. But if you reduce the volume of training, you get reversal of that. And you can see after the taper, so this is after a period of lower volume training, the type 2X fiber composition percentage is actually higher, which theoretically could give the sprint athlete an advantage. So this could be the theoretical physiological advantage of a taper for a sprint athlete. Question here for you about endurance athletes. So they often use tapers. Which of these tapers would be best for an endurance athlete such as a 10K runner? So is it rest for 7 days, high intensity, low volume taper for 7 days, or lower intensity, moderate volume taper? Your best answer here is to go high intensity, low volume. So in this case, with the 10K runner, they ended up going, say, multiple 400-meter intervals, say 10 of them per session. So instead of running 10K, they're running, 4K, but they're doing it at a high volume, or sorry, a high intensity, but at low volume. That would be the start of the 7-day taper. Towards the end of the 7-day taper, they might be just doing 1 or 2 of those 400-meter runs until the end of the taper, where they might take a day off before the competition. So that type of high intensity, low volume taper, there are studies that show that you do get some positive physiological adaptations compared to other types of tapers. So you get an increase in your oxidative enzymes in your muscle, you get an increase in muscle glycogen, and that translates to an increase in running performance. The last section of the course that I'll cover, I'm going to spend about 5 or 10 minutes on this, is exercise and bone. So measurements. Bone is usually measured, if you're assessing someone for osteoporosis or their bone health, usually the measurements are done with a machine that's called a dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. So I'm going to write that out here. It's called dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. I ran out of space there, but dual energy X-ray absorptiometry measures your bone density. So it measures your bone density, not true density, but areal bone density. So the mass of the bone that you have for every area centimeter squared in your bone. So it's essentially grams of bone in a given area of the bone. True density is grams for cubic centimeter. So true density, this is true density. You get what's called areal bone density with the dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. We do have one of these in our college. It's kind of hidden away. We reserve it mainly for research purposes. But you can also get a pretty good body composition assessment with this. So your body fat and muscle mass. When we're assessing people for bone health, usually we do a scan at the hip. So that's what you see here. And a scan at the lumbar spine. So these are your lumbar vertebrae. And these areas are susceptible to bone loss as you age because you have a type of bone here that has a higher turnover. So you have two types of bone. One's trabecular bone, and one is called cortical bone. This bone is more solid and stronger. This bone is kind of softer. The trabecular bone has a higher turnover. Cortical bone has a slower turnover. So these areas of the body, the hip and the lumbar spine, have a lot of trabecular bone. So those are the areas that you tend to lose bone as you age. That's where you'll lose bone first, and fractures are common in those areas in older individuals. Another reason why these bones are susceptible to fracture is they don't have many muscle attachments. So muscle usually pulls on bone, causes a strain on bone, and that actually makes the bone stronger. So in these areas, you have a lack of muscle attachments, and that results in less force being applied to the bones and a loss of bone density in those areas. Now, is bone density the only determinant of bone strength? You probably guess no. So you can have alterations in architecture of bone. So this is a three-dimensional CT scan of bones, and this is an osteoporotic bone, so bone from an older individual. This is bone from a healthier individual. So what we're looking at here is the architectural arrangement of the trabeculi in the bone. So the trabeculi just refers to all these little connections in the bone. So you have a greater trabecular spacing here. The trabeculae here are tighter. You can see the outside of the bone is a cortical shell, so it's thicker here. That's the hard, solid cortical bone. Inside here is the trabecular bone. You can see the cortical shell is thinner here, and the trabecular bone has more holes in it. Now, bone turns over in a cycle of what's called modeling and remodeling. So throughout your life, bone is constantly being resorbed or broken down and then reformed. And the purpose here is to repair microdamage of your bone. So that occurs anytime you exercise, and also to maintain blood calcium levels. So your bone acts as a good bank of calcium. And your calcium, as you know, is important for nervous system and muscle tissue excitability. So it's released from your sarcoplasmic reticulum would be one example. And so your bone turns over in this cycle for these reasons. This diagram represents the bone cells that are involved as your bone turns over throughout your life. So here you have your mineralized bone, so it's calcium and phosphate that are embedded in a kind of a protein matrix. You've got osteoblasts. These are your bone forming cells. And you've got osteoid, which is your immature cells, bone. So this is mainly type 1 collagen. It's unmineralized, so it doesn't have much calcium or phosphate deposited. It's mainly protein, which is type 1 collagen. The first stage of your bone remodeling cycle is called activation. That's when an osteoclast would come in here. So osteoclasts are cells that break down bone. So it's going to attach to the bone here and actually eat away at the bone, releasing calcium into the blood. Then an osteoblast would be activated, come in here, and cause bone formation. So it builds your bone back up. So this is kind of a summary. Osteoblasts are the cells that are involved in bone formation. Osteoclasts are cells involved in breakdown of bone. The osteocytes are cells involved in the detection of loads on bone. So the osteocytes are these cells that are embedded in the bone matrix here. They actually detect loads that are applied to bone. They'll release growth factors that will activate the osteoblast, the bone forming cells, and perhaps inhibit the osteoclast, the cells that are involved in bone resorption. And you've got osteoid down here. That's immature bone, that's unmineralized. Again, this is mainly composed of type 1 collagen. Exercise and bone formation. So from animal studies, they've gained an understanding of what types of exercises are best for building bone. So the strain that they've applied to bone in these animal studies refers to the deformation of bone by applying loads. And these are the optimal strain characteristics you get for inducing bone formation. So strains that are high in frequency, that are applied rapidly over time. High strain rates means that you're applying a high load very fast. Strains high in magnitude, abnormally distributed strains, so something that you're not really used to, will induce more bone formation. Dynamic strains, so those that involve movement, are better than static strains, so something that is just holding the strain on the bone. And then the responsiveness of bone to a strain induced by exercise is reduced the longer the strain is applied. So if you can apply a strain frequently throughout the day, it's better than applying all the strain at once. And I'll get into specific examples of each of these. So, which type of exercise would be better for bone based on those strain characteristics using isometric contractions or running? Probably running, because dynamic strains are better than static strains. Recall isometrics, you don't really have that much movement. Doing sprint intervals or jogging, the sprint intervals would be better because you're running at higher frequency than you do when you're jogging. So your legs are just moving faster at a higher frequency. Doing plyometrics by jumping over cones, or doing the same plyometrics except jumping over the cones sideways. It would be the second one, doing the plyometrics jumping over the cones sideways, because that's a movement pattern that you're not really used to. Abnormally distributed strains will be more effective for building bone. Let's say doing 40 minutes of exercise 3 days per week, or doing 20 minutes of exercise twice a day for 3 days per week. So in both of these cases, you're getting the same volume of training, but you've split up the training sessions here. The answer to this one would be the second one again, splitting up your sessions twice a day instead of doing everything all at once. And that applies to this principle. The responsiveness of bone to a strain is reduced the longer you hold that strain, so the longer the strain is applied. So in this case, the strain is applied for 40 minutes. The strain might be effective at the start of exercise for inducing bone formation, and then that effectiveness of the strain is reduced the longer this is held. So if you do 20-minute sessions twice a day, you'll get a greater effectiveness from the same amount of strain, same amount of loading. Optimal strain characteristics. I'm giving this example of a study that we ran in our college that involved older women throwing a medicine ball against a wall, then catching it. So this would be, applying a lot of these strain characteristics to something high in frequency, high strain rate is being done at a fast speed, high magnitude with a medicine ball. It's probably abnormally distributed at the angle that they're doing it here. And it's dynamic. So in this type of exercise, over 9 months, we saw significant increases in bone mineral content in the wrist compared to a control group that did no exercise. Again, looking at these strain characteristics to ask yourself, which sport would incorporate a lot of these characteristics. And a really beneficial sport for building bone is gymnastics. It involves a lot of high loading, loads that are abnormally distributed, as you can see in this example. And this is just another study we ran with kids. We looked at gymnasts, ex-gymnasts, and non-gymnasts. The bottom line here, the most important message, is the kids that were involved in gymnastics, they had greater bone mineral content in their hips, so at the femoral neck, even starting from age of 4. And you can see the different age groups. They were quite different from the other age groups. Now, the last point I want to make is that exercise training is effective for increasing bone density, but you see greater changes in bone, but in the negative direction if you're inactive. So something like bed rest, space flight, casting, paralysis, that will all dramatically decrease your bone density. And that's best illustrated by this graph. This is from a girl that was involved in a weight training program, and they're looking at bone density in her legs. So this is over 12 months of, say, doing leg press exercise. Her bone density increases a little bit over those 12 months. Then she had a knee injury in a ski accident, and her leg was put in a cast, and then her bone density just plummeted. So you can see if you increase your physical activity levels, you can get a small increase in bone density. If you decrease your normal physical activity levels, your bone density just takes a huge dive. And that's pretty much all I wanted to cover for the course.